Now, thousands of police officers were on standby in preparation for potential unrest last night. But the overwhelming majority of events passed peacefully, with thousands of anti-racism demonstrators turning out at locations around England. Now, businesses did board up windows and many closed early after fears that around 100 far-right events would take place. But the counter-demonstrations in locations where far-right protests had been expected, including North London, Bristol and Newcastle, were largely peaceful. All of this comes as the Crown Prosecution Service says around 140 people have been charged so far in relation to the riots and violent disorder of recent days. 3 men were jailed yesterday. 58-year-old Derek Drummond was given a 3-year sentence for punching a police officer during violence in Southport. 29-year-old Declan Guerin was jailed for 2.5 years for violent disorder and setting fire to a police vehicle. 41-year-old Liam James Riley was jailed for 20 months for violent disorder and racially aggravated abusive behaviour. Now, in the last half hour, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, has said that thousands of officers have been deployed across England and called it a very successful night after fears of far-right disorder were abated.
We put thousands of officers on the street, and I think the show of force from the police and, frankly, the show of unity from communities together defeated the challenges that we've seen. And it went off very peacefully last night. A couple of locations we had some local criminals turn out and try and create a bit of antisocial behaviour, and we arrested a few of them. But it was a very successful night, and the fears of sort of extreme right disorder were abated.
We're joined now by Policing Minister Dame Diana Johnson. Very good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning. How do you summarise events as they unfolded last night?
Well, can I first of all just express my gratitude to all those police officers who were on duty last night and have in previous days faced levels of violence, thuggery and hooliganism which has been absolutely unacceptable, and have done so with bravery and courage, and I think we just need to mark that. I also just want to pay tribute to the policing leaders like Sir Mark for the work that they've done to ensure that communities were safe last night, and I'm cautiously welcoming what happened last night. There are obviously the days ahead that we need to get through as well, but that level of criminality and disorder that we've seen over previous days, that didn't happen last night, and that is to be very welcomed.
Can I ask you about those people who turned up for those counter-protests, as they're being dubbed? Police had advised people not to come out, but they did. Do you also praise those people for what they did?
Well, I think this country has a tradition, doesn't it, of peaceful protests, and I think last night was an example of that. Now, clearly, because of what had happened in previous days, we were very anxious that we didn't add to the burden on the police by having to police counter-demonstrations and protests. But luckily last night, everything on the whole was peaceful, so that's important. But I think what last night illustrated was the vast majority of people in this country are law-abiding, are tolerant, respect the police, want their communities to be ones that are safe for all communities. And I think that was demonstrated last night by some of what we saw on the streets with those people who came forward to make their views clear. Because unfortunately, in the last few nights, what we'd seen was those kind of the very small criminal element. The extremists were out on the streets engaging in disorder and violence, and that's not what Britain is. That is not what the British people are about.
In the run-up to last night, police included did offer up information they had about what they were worried about, the scale of the number of protests involved. As we speak this morning, what can you share with us about either your concerns or your knowledge about what might lie ahead in the next few days?
Well, clearly there is intelligence about protests, processions over the next few days leading into the weekend. But what I'm really clear about is that the police response, the numbers, the mobilisation that we've seen to get the police officers onto our streets and to be available if disorder occurs is really important and has had a good effect. And also, I have to say, the response then of the police in terms of arresting those people who were involved in criminal acts over the last week, bringing them into police stations, getting them charged, getting them then in front of a court. And yesterday, as you said earlier in your package, people are now going to prison for the acts they carried out on our streets in the last few days. And we saw one case yesterday of a man who punched a police officer going to prison for 3 years. So I think that swift justice is really important. Over 400 people have been arrested. I'm hoping, and I know that number will increase today. We've got over 140 people charged. That number will go up as well. And we will start to see, again today, more people going into court and receiving sentences. And very importantly as well, I just want to make this point, it's not just those physical acts on the street that we're going to make sure people are brought to account for, but it's also what's happening online. And that's really important. This week we saw the first person being charged and convicted of what he'd done online, inciting violence, racial violence, and that is important. If you do stuff online, we will come for you just as much as we will come for you for what you do on the streets of our country if you're carrying out criminal disorder and violence.
I think you referenced intelligence and concern about protests that are planned over the next few days into the weekend. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Well, that's obviously a matter for the police to prepare on the intelligence that they have available, the appropriate policing response. But you will know that on social media there's information available about what protests are going to take place. But I mean that's on social media, and that's one of the other issues that we've got, is that kind of information being put onto social media on these platforms. It's really important that those social media companies understand that they have a responsibility not to have postings which are inciting racial hatred or violence in our communities. So I know Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State for Technology, is having meetings with those social media companies to make sure they understand that they have responsibilities. And whilst the Online Safety Act in all aspects isn't fully enforced yet, there is nothing to stop those social media companies taking steps now to do everything they need to do to remove illegal criminal content from their platforms. And I hope they will take heed of what Ofcom said to them yesterday when they wrote an open letter telling them to get on and put in place all the measures they need to clean up the social media platforms.
You talked about the number of arrests, which I think has remained fairly static over, I think, the last 2 or 3 days, around the 400 mark, and you expect that to rise. Have you got from police any notion of how many people in all were involved in those, the violence against the police, those incidents, in terms of the overall number? I know we have this number of the arrests, but it'd be quite useful if we do they have any kind of indication of just how many people were involved?
Well, I think that number is obviously being worked on, and as you say, the number of arrests I'm expecting to rise as the police do their work, looking at CCTV footage, looking at social media posts. I know in Humberside they've been doing a tremendous job of actually asking the public for help to identify perpetrators. We had looting in some of the shops in Hull, and there are very clear images of people taking things, stealing from shops, and all those people will be held to account for their criminal acts. So that work is ongoing. I know the police are putting in a lot of resource to do that, and I know that prosecutors are there to help advise the police to make sure that the right charges are brought against these individuals.
Dame Diana Johnson, Minister of State for Police and Crime Prevention, thank you for your time this morning.